And then for our final topic, that being aging and scavenging, which I kind of mentioned was one of the most often forgotten configurations for a new DNS server. DNS aging and scavenging is a mechanism to essentially get rid of records that have been stale. As you can imagine, when you've got machines that are moving around, you've got laptops that are coming on and off the network, well, that laptop, when it leaves the network, sometimes doesn't get the same IP address when it comes back on. If the user ends up being gone for a week or two, well, that laptop can probably get the next IP address that your DHCP server can give to it. And so with aging and scavenging, the first half is aging, where a dynamically updated DNS record is added to your DNS zone and is added also with a timestamp. This timestamp is used to essentially put a time bomb on that record so that the record can be removed after a certain period of time. The timestamp then, the time bomb value, is reset anytime the record is created, when it's modified, or when that record happens to be refreshed. And Windows hosts will refresh their records during three events. Number one, when they're booted, so at startup, anytime there's a DHCP lease renewal, or every 24 hours. And so what this does is it gives the records and the machines on the network the abilities to keep that same DHCP address and that same DNS resolution as long as they're continually attached to your network. The machine has to be able to talk to your DNS server to go about refreshing the record. Now, when machines go off the network for extended periods of time, we have to have some way to remove the record as well. And that's the second half, the scavenging part of DNS aging and scavenging. The scavenging actually is what removes the records, the stale records from your DNS database. And it uses two different intervals that are really important to understand so that you know why these records are ending up disappearing out of DNS at what can seem to be random periods of time. The refresh interval is a period that if the client does not refresh its record by the end of that period, the scavenging process removes the record. Now, the refresh interval by default is 7 days. So at the end of 7 days, if there's no client around to refresh its record, or if the client's powered off for that period of time, well, then the scavenging process is going to realize that that client doesn't exist and remove the record out of DNS. We, however, have to be careful about this removal of records because we don't want to go about removing records too quickly. And so there is also a no refresh interval, which is a period of time before the refresh interval, also about 7 days by default, where any client refreshes are simply ignored by the server. So every 24 hours, if that client happens to be online, the server will ignore the refresh. This is done in order to reduce the amount of replication and DNS replication that has to happen between different servers in the environment. Now, this can be kind of challenging to figure out why this happens, so I put together a little graphic here to help you figure out what exactly is going on between the no refresh and the refresh interval. As I said, by default, that process is 7 days for each, so a total of 14 days. However, there's a lot of work that goes on inside that 14 days. Let's assume that time moves from left to right, and you create a record and a machine ends up on the network. For the first 7 days, that machine goes through and requests a refresh of its record. But because it's during that first 7-day no refresh interval, your DNS server ignores the refresh requests. That continues until we enter the refresh interval, which is the last little diamond down here over on the right. When that first refresh occurs, at the beginning of the refresh interval, then DNS goes about accepting the refresh and starting the process anew. This process then recontinues for another 7 days for the no refresh interval, until the client again attempts a refresh once you've entered in the refresh interval after that first 7 days. When that occurs, the record is again refreshed. Now at this point, let's assume that the client leaves the network. A person goes on a 2-week vacation or a slightly less than 2-week vacation. And as you can see here, we have 2 refresh requests, but time continues to move to the right, and we eventually make our way all the way to the end of the 14 days. At that point, the client is still not on the network, and so can't request a refresh of its DNS record. When that occurs and we get to the end of that 14-day period, it's then and only then that the record gets deleted. Now, one of the big reasons why this aging and scavenging configuration kind of gets missed in a lot of environments is because aging and scavenging is actually configured in a couple of different places. Number one, it has to be configured on the server. And then number two, it has to be configured on each individual zone. Once done there, there are also further configurations that can be done on any static records that need to be made dynamic. Let's start up here under our domain controller, where if we right-click and choose Properties down here, we can configure the refresh interval for this machine. That refresh interval is configured right over here under Advanced. Down here you see automatic scavenging of stale records, where if I check the box, the scavenging period is set for 7 days. This is the first of the 3 settings that we need to take a look at. If we set it here for each server, so DC and then down for DC2 as well, we also have to come down here to company.pri and make the configuration again, down here under Properties. It's over here where we can set the further aging and scavenging properties over here in the Aging button. Here, if I click the checkbox here, this will scavenge the stale resource records and configure the no refresh and refresh intervals for both to be 7 days. You need to do this on all the different zones that you want to configure aging and scavenging on. If I choose the OK button here and OK, I can go about actually enabling aging and scavenging for this zone, company.pri. Now I'll show you also that back here under DC, there's kind of a shortcut here that says Set Aging and Scavenging for All Zones. You might be kind of careful with this one, if only because sometimes you end up with zones that you might not necessarily want aging and scavenging turned on. As I said, aging and scavenging are designed for zones where there's a lot of dynamic stuff going on, clients that are coming in and out of the network, and laptops and devices and so on. But here in this server, we also have a zone called company.com that we configured specifically to host the records for our externally facing machines, like our web server, for example. And so you might not necessarily want to turn on aging and scavenging when you have a fairly static zone like this company.com zone here. Again, it exists up there as a selection, but just be careful whenever you're making these configurations. The last thing I want to show you is that for each of the records, I can come down here and identify what the timestamp would be for the record. Notice how a lot of these records here are configured as static records. And in fact, if I take a look at file 2 here, you can see that the checkbox for delete this record when it becomes stale is unselected, and there's no record timestamp configured. This is because this server was configured with a static IP address, which is different from my desktop here, which is configured with a dynamic IP address coming from DHCP. And so the checkbox is automatically checked for this record, and the record timestamp is configured as well. If I needed to take a static record and make it dynamic and make it part of this aging and scavenging thing that I've turned on, the way in which I do that just simply is by coming back here to the static record and selecting the box to delete the record when it becomes stale. This can help you if you've got static records that existed before you turned on the dynamic part of this, that you just need to get out of the server. But you want to do so without actually deleting the record. So you would use this when you want to age the record, but not specifically delete it until you know for sure it needs to be deleted.